Hello. I want to touch on an aspect of feminism that I haven't really touched on much before. I've made a lot of videos about this subject, and I think this is something that takes a different angle, or at least a different aspect, which I haven't touched on. So I want to discuss this a little bit, and that is the argument often made by feminists that feminism is favourable to men and beneficial to men. Um, No, I should be candid. If you've seen my videos, you'll know I'm very, very skeptical of third wave feminism. And I'm not going to go through all the reasons in detail. I'm not going to repeat myself. But just to summarize, I believe that Western third wave feminism is fundamentally dishonest, incredibly hypocritical, and divisive. So for all those reasons, and many other reasons, I'm very skeptical of it. Um, but one thing that has come up occasionally is when I've been in debates with feminists is the argument they put forward that feminism is beneficial to men. So I want to sort of address this and what I feel is the things that they're trying to get at with this. Firstly, I should emphasize I'm not an MRA. It is important to say this because I think there's a perception that anyone who's very opposed to feminism, I don't even call myself anti-feminist. Um, the reason I say that I'm not anti-feminist is because I'm not opposed to all feminist movements around the world. I don't make that sort of blanket claim that all feminism is bad. I think that would be a bit ignorant because it's not all bad. And I think those of us who take issue with third wave feminism need to recognize that there are definitely parts of the world where specific women's rights issues are needed. Um, so rather, yeah, so this idea that feminism is beneficial to men is something that tends to come from other feminist people who presumably are trying to reach out. Either that or they're just being dishonest. But I'll try to not be too cynical and I'll assume that they're doing it for the right reasons. Um, so, where does that claim stem from? I think it comes from the idea that patriarchy, this idea of male dominated society, um, impacted men just as much as women. It impacted women in the sense that women couldn't have equal rights to vote and own property and that sort of thing. But it impacted men due to the pressure put on men. Now, sometimes I've brought up the issue of so-called male privilege. There's a bit of an inconsistency in talking about how patriarchy negatively impacted men, whilst at the same time arguing in such a thing as male privilege. I think a more accurate description would be that in history, there's been a small number of men in elite positions who have had privilege. Yes, it's been more men than women, but the fact of the matter is, the vast majority of men were not privileged throughout history and today. Privilege is a loaded word because it implies that you sort of have VIP status. Now, one thing that I've often brought up, and I know that other people critical of feminism often bring up, is if men are privileged, then where's the privilege of the hundreds of thousands of men who have died in both world wars, for example? Millions, in fact, when we look collectively at different countries. Not just killed, but also wounded and mentally scarred, who suffered unimaginably. Now, when I've brought this up with, and I'll try not to go off on a tangent here, but when I've brought this up with female feminists, they say things like, oh, well, everyone suffers in war. That's true today, especially today. But in a historical context, for example, the First World War, to give the United Kingdom as an example, the vast majority of British fatalities of World War One were men, the vast majority. It is true that there were women killed in munitions disasters. For example, the so-called Canaries, women who were working in munitions factories. They did take risks, and there were a number of serious accidents. There were also a few aerial raids. but the numbers killed amounted to a few hundred, maybe a few thousand. That's dwarfed by the hundreds of thousands of men killed and wounded. Now, that's not, it's just a statement of fact, okay? It's just a basic statement of fact that the vast majority of fatalities, at least in this country, in World War One were men. So I don't think that saying that should be particularly controversial because it is just a fact. And, feel very free to look it up. Don't take my word for it. Look it up. Does that mean that women didn't suffer? Of course not. But I think critics of feminism feel very frustrated with this notion of male privilege because it insinuates that there's always been male privilege. Um, so that's the first thing I'd like to observe, that there's a contradiction by saying that feminism cares about male suffering, whilst at the same time saying men are privileged. If men are privileged, then we're not suffering, are we? We're in luxurious conditions and we're really enjoying all the benefits of being a man. It's wonderful, you know? So there's an inconsistency in that argument. You can't say feminism helps men, men are privileged. It's either or, Um, that would almost be like African Americans saying that the civil rights movement helped white Americans, or maybe that's a strange analogy, but it's just a very strange argument to make. To say on one hand that men are privileged, but hey, feminism also helps men, because it's inconsistent. Then the second part, feminism also helps men, is a recognition that men also face issues unique to them. Now, I would argue so that's basically tackling the point of so-called male privilege. It's something that I really take issue with. But to cut to another issue, the idea of feminism as a movement actually helping men. Believe it or not, I actually agree. I do actually believe that first wave feminism, especially, was arguably very beneficial to men. In talking about the world wars, we have to remember that some of the most outspoken pacifists in the First World War were the suffragettes. The Pankhurst family actually became divided. Um, it's not well known, but Emmeline Pankhurst actually she sort of put aside her feminism throughout the war years um, to become a cheerleader for the war. She was conservative and she was actually very pro-war. And ironically, when she put aside the campaign for votes for women, she had no problem encouraging and promoting the idea of young men going and sacrificing themselves. Now, of course, many men done that as well. But anyway, the point is, if Pankhurst's family was divided, one of her daughters, I believe it was Sylvia, became a dedicated socialist and pacifist, and I give her a lot of credit for that. I believe she deserves respect for, in some ways, brave in the sense that she was vilified as a traitor for doing so, as was every socialist at the time. But I do recognise that early feminists cared about the fact that they were seeing their brothers and their fathers and their cousins and so on coming back horribly maimed and mentally scarred. So those women had compassion, in my opinion. So early feminism, in that sense, certainly a part of it was help. Was did care about men. Okay. Also, the gradual movement especially in the first half of the 20th century, taking on notions of patriarchy, and then into second wave feminism with the notion of gender identity. I would argue that probably had some positive aspects. I mean, men have to be grateful to that feminism for example, taking away the notion that, oh, men should be tough and men should never express emotions and this sort of thing. Um, there are some guys and some women who say that men have become too feminized nowadays. But actually, this is one area where we absolutely cannot blame feminism. What I mean by that is, the whole pressure on men to be tough, not show their emotions. That was definitely not feminism that done that. That was patriarchy, and it was all in men. Sometimes the people who treat men the worst way are not women, but other men, and that's something that, for example, MRAs need to acknowledge. You guys believe that feminism is responsible for all the problems that you face. Now, I'm no fan of feminism, but that's just plain wrong. Um, for example, this notion of, and there's a lot of things. Chivalry's another issue. With chivalry, a lot of men resent the idea that women should be treated in a special way. But actually, feminists themselves don't usually push the chivalrous aspect. But from what I know, most feminists find chivalry offensive, whatever. But the sort of women who um, tend to appreciate the sort of alpha male type of man don't tend to be feminists. This is something that maybe isn't looked at quite enough. I mean, I absolutely understand guys because I relate to this myself, being frustrated with the constant negativity that comes from feminism. But where I do draw a line is blaming feminism for everything. Then that's ridiculous. Definitely, feminism hasn't helped in recent years. In terms of actively being a barrier to to trying to campaign on men's issues. Because, for example, when the issue of unfairness in family courts is brought up, feminists often stand in the way of that. There's no good feminists just saying they acknowledge those issues because very often they actually stand in the way of those issues. Um, by the way, sorry for the inconsistency here. I'm sort of taking on both points of view at once, I guess. Um, but anyway, keeping more on track here, does feminism help men? Well, some of the traditional expectations of men, for example, to not show emotions, to be, especially to be the breadwinner. Now, in the 20th century, the move to give women more independence and jobs, arguably that was very good for men because then you had a situation where women were earning their own salaries. So, when men sort of, you sometimes you get guys who get very angry and they're like, oh, a woman just lives with me and she takes all my money, etc. But the feminist move to give women more job independence actually give men a bit more freedom because they didn't always have to give women their money that they'd worked hard for. Therefore, giving women more job opportunities was good for women, obviously, but was also good for men because it frankly took some pressure off men to be breadwinners. Now, when men traditionally resented that, and especially from, let's say, between about the 40s and the 70s, there was a lot of resentment from alpha males, from the notion of women getting their own work. And even today, that is an issue to some men that don't like it. But it could be argued, and I think those guys need to reflect on the fact, well, wait a second, if if she's just being a housewife, then you're supporting her entirely. There's more pressure on you, so it adversely affects you in that sense. Um, by the way, I have no problem with housewives. I have no problem with women choosing to be at home. But it's the idea that women having job independence somehow affects men. I think is ridiculous. Although I think that's less of an issue nowadays. I think that was more for me. There's a film made a while back about a mining community, I believe. American film. I can't remember what it's called, but it was more or less about the subject. Um, anyway, I'm sorry for the lack of consistency with this video because I'm sort of trying to tackle both points at the same time. On one hand, I'm looking at how um, feminism today doesn't particularly help men, but traditionally, I believe that it did do important things. Now, in many conservative parts of the world where feminism is a lot less obvious, there is arguably more pressure on men. I'm not talking about more suffering of men, but more pressure on men um, to, for example, be financially strong. Although that's arguably a worldwide phenomenon, but the truth is there's many people, both men and women, that expect men to be financially strong. If a man is struggling financially, he's seen as a loser. And it's both men and women that view that. I reckon most women, if they're being honest, want to be with a man who's financially stable. Not necessarily rich, but financially stable. And this is especially obvious in countries that are more socially conservative. I'd cite China as an example because I know it well. I'm very familiar with that. A lot of Chinese women, and if you're a Chinese woman and you're not like this, I apologize. I'm not generalizing, but a lot of Chinese women do have quite a traditional idea of what a man should be. They expect the man to be financially strong and to be sort of the leader in a relationship. In Western countries where feminism is more obvious, it's a bit more, in that sense, it's a little bit more equal. In that sense. So, and I'm just quoting China as one example. There's probably other examples. I mean, I sometimes think that I've spoken to male Chinese friends, and they would certainly testify that there's enormous pressure out there. Although the thing about financial pressure is something that arguably exists all over the world. And I do think men are more adversely affected than women because I'm not saying women don't suffer the impact of unemployment. I'm certainly not saying that. But there is more of an expectation of men to be financially strong. Um, although I guess women would argue that they can be branded as gold diggers. So both genders can be dismissed in a certain way. Um, okay, so I've covered a lot of issues there, but a few closing points. What I've tried to get at here is to tackle the argument feminists often make that feminism is good for men. What I would say in response to that is, based on the things I've said, I've acknowledged that feminism inadvertently has done some good things for men. It has freed, to some extent, the pressure on men to be expected to be sole breadwinner in the grounds that it's promoted equal opportunities for women in work. Um, I would argue that certainly early feminism did did speak out against male sacrifice in war, the expectation the men should die for king and country, and for women actually. That was something that feminism also done in favor of men. Um, and actually, I think a lot of the time when men resent women, it isn't always women who are actually feminists. Sometimes women who have the most negative attitude towards men are not actually feminists, but traditional women. What I mean by that is there are women who would be very. I have to be careful with the wording I'm using here because I know it can be thrown around a bit, but sometimes the women who sort of expect men to be strong, etc. That's not feminists. I don't think you could say that as feminists who expect that. So yeah, I think there has been some positive things, and I acknowledge that. But I think there's very little evidence of it in contemporary feminism, and it's contemporary feminism that I tend to focus on. It's all very well talking about the history of the movement, and it is important to acknowledge that. But I do think that we also need to look at the current situation, and I don't see any evidence that the feminist movement in Western countries does anything for men. I've seen no evidence of it, because when men's issues are brought up, it's usually feminism and sometimes other men that stands in the way. Now, I'll just say a quick word about gender roles because I should have brought this into the video a bit earlier. I suppose feminism can also be credited with breaking down the assumptions on the way a man should be. And actually, some of the men who are most critical and who put the most pressure on other men, um, well, are other men. I mean, when you have a bravado environment, whether it be in a sports gym, whether it be in a traditionally alpha male sort of job like firefighting or the police or the army for that matter, any man who shows any sort of sensitivity or emotions whatsoever, it's other men that will laugh at him and ridicule him. So you can't blame feminism for that. That is definitely other men. So to feminists who watch my videos and who don't think I'm open-minded, I hope from this video you will see that at least I'm open-minded enough to not blame feminism for everything. I don't. But I do believe that if you want to say that feminism helps men, then you know you have to prove it in a contemporary setting, not just looking at these historical issues, but in a contemporary setting. And I'm afraid I don't see much evidence of it in a contemporary setting. Because if feminism really did care about men in a contemporary setting, it would be campaigning on issues that impact men as well. If it was a truly egalitarian movement, yes, it would be campaigning on women's issues, but it would also be campaigning on men's issues, and it simply doesn't. Now, I guess this relates to a large extent to my previous video about male feminists, because I suspect a lot of men sort of endorse feminism because they dislike the macho alpha male culture, and I totally understand that. But I don't think that means you have to endorse feminism. I think whatever. I'm not going to tell other people how to think. But anyway, that's just my views. I'm sorry that it's been a little bit inconsistent, but I've tried to cover up things here. Thanks for watching.